Let's do it.
All right. Hey, this is Mark Rose and Coach Rozy here with our Coach Rozy Chalk Talk. And Coach, I appreciate you joining us today. We got Coach Nick with us today. And Coach, you're out of Florida. Is that where you're at?
Yeah, I am based out of Southwest Florida. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And Nick and I actually didn't know each other. We've known each other's names and kind of came across each other on through social media and through the NSCA stuff. And so I asked Nick if he'd come on the program. And Nick, for those that don't know you, and even just to help me out a little bit, you want to give our folks a little bit of information about your background and how you went from where you're at to where you're at now.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So I have been in the industry for about the last 10 years or so. Started off just kind of the standard trainer route, standard strength and conditioning route, working in a lot of big box gyms and just trying to train as many people as possible, work with as many people as possible. Transitioned into more of the rehabilitative space, which is where I spent probably vast majority of my career to this point, really diving into variables that go into predisposing someone to injury more so than someone else, whether it's just your general population or the athletic population as well. The things that go beyond just the musculoskeletal aspects, right? Stress, nutrition, and then obviously sleep being a really big piece of that. And I just became fascinated with everything about sleep. I became fascinated with how little attention it was getting in our actual coaching. When we talk about coaching up a person or coaching up an athlete, it's very rare that we're going through the process of actually coaching their sleep the same way that we do their exercise and nutrition. So I've been providing, sleep coaching in person and virtually for the last few years. And then within the last year, I've pivoted where, a little bit more of my focus right now is on educating other coaches and other practitioners on how they can go this process of sleep and sleep coaching with their clients and athletes as well.
So let me ask you this. What's kind of one of the first steps? I mean, one from an athlete standpoint, when you talk to athletes, but when you start working with coaches, and I know sleep's huge. Like before the show we were talking about, I need to probably hire you to be my coach because I'm a bad sleep guy. Probably, get 4 or 5 hours a night, which I know is terrible. But you want to maybe go through some of the physical and mental components of if you're getting lack of sleep, and then where do you start from, like square one? If somebody like myself would come to you and say, "Hey, I'm not getting sleep. What should I do?" But kind of the pitfalls if you're not getting the sleep. What would you say?
For sure. I think the first thing I'll say, caveat with this is, the audience when I'm talking about this type of thing, when we talk about the correlations with sleep matters. And what I mean by that is when I'm talking to coaches and practitioners and people who are working with other people on their sleep, to understand these mechanisms and just how important sleep is and just how much of an impact it can have is imperative, right? You have to understand these things, especially in order to place an emphasis on it in your process, whether you're a strength and conditioning coach or whatever it is. You have to really value just how important it is. But if you're the person who's struggling with sleep, and this is a good, segue in terms of coaching, you want to make sure you're not placing too much focus on the things that are negative when you're not getting sleep. So what I mean by that is if I was working with you from a coaching perspective, right? You were my client, day one or really at all, we would not spend a lot of time, if any, going through like, "Hey, Mark, this is what happens when you don't sleep. And this is what, this is how shitty your life is going to be if you're not getting, the sleep that you need to be getting," right? Because very often what I find is a lot of sleep issues are very behavioral in nature, especially chronic sleep issues. And people start to have a lot of negative context around their sleep and negative thoughts around their sleep. So if I just throw things that are, kind of fear-inducing in a way, I'm going to really perpetuate that. And, I'm going to drive a lot of those negative behaviors further. But, being that a good amount of the audience I know is, strength and conditioning professionals and people who are going to be working with other people, I think you have to look at sleep as being really a foundational pillar in every way, shape, or form. So I don't think there's any one lever that we can pull with any intervention that has as much impact as sleep. So I look at it as the ultimate life enhancer, whether it's working with the general population or it's working with an athlete at any stage. There is not one thing that we can do that will have more of a profound impact across the board. Sure, we can interject exercise interventions, we can improve nutrition, we can improve all these other facets, but sleep is that one thing that will literally impact every single facet of what you're trying to do with someone. So whether it's their mental preparation, right, their emotional regulation and ability to handle things that way, whether it's their physical ability to perform day to day in competition, whatever it is, and their ability to recover after that, to be able to go again, every single facet is going to be impacted by sleep. So, a big part of the starting with, talking to other coaches and practitioners is really just laying that framework for just how important sleep is.
Well, okay, let me ask you this, because
Yeah.
as a strength coach and kind of an old dog, I'm like, okay, like I tell my athletes, like, hey, you need to get some sleep, you need to get some rest.
Mhm.
But from my own standpoint, it's like hectic schedule, up early in the morning because training is in the morning. It's like, yes, I understand that sleep I should be getting more sleep. So then what would be the steps? It's like, yes, you know the importance of it. Because we have some athletes that do the same thing. It's like, I need to get more sleep, but I know it's a little bit different situation now with everything going on, but they're like, well, when I got home from practice, I had to eat, then I had to do studies, then I had to do A, B, and C, my life. So I wasn't able to get to bed until 11 o'clock, but I had to get up at 5 for morning practice or morning workouts. It's like, I know it, but then to implement and practice it are almost two different things sometimes.
For sure. So the first step, and it always comes down to prioritization and on really prioritizing it. So you kind of hit it exactly that. It starts with us as the coaches, right? As the person who is responsible for that person's performance and well-being and accountability, right? So it starts with us. So the things that we prioritize with them are the things that they're ultimately going to prioritize. So if they have a small window of time and we're having them prioritize something else as opposed to maybe a pre-sleep routine, then they're missing the boat on the potential for that sleep. So I think it's exactly that. It's exactly what you talked about, right? Where you have an athlete that you're working with and you're telling them they need to sleep more. But I always liken this to exercise just because it's usually much more relatable. I always liken sleep to exercise. Imagine you had someone that was coming to work with you, right? An athlete that was coming to work with you and they wanted to get from A to Z. And there was a list of exercises and things that you wanted them to do. You wouldn't just hand them a list or tell them to go do it, right? You'd coach them on each one of those things on how to actually do them and how to actually implement them. And the same should be applied to sleep. Too often, as a coach or a practitioner, we're either just telling someone to sleep better, which you can't just will yourself to better sleep, right? Or we're just giving them, or a list of the top 10 sleep tips. Like, hey, these are sleep hygiene tips. But there's no context. There's no individuality to what that person actually needs, what they're actually struggling with. So, I think if we put the lens on of being a coach, just like we do in any other facet of, all right, great, someone comes in, I look at how they squat and I see A, B, and C wrong, and I have interventions to fix it. Same applies for sleep. Someone comes in with a sleep issue, I'm going to look at A, B, and C and know where I need to focus, right? So.
And I know when you were talking, you mentioned a pre-sleep routine.
Mm-hmm.
You maybe want to talk about that a little bit. I know I had a buddy who was a SEAL team member and, crazy schedule when he was active. Then he said when he came back, he said it was just because his routine had been so messed up for so long, for 10 years, he had to really change his whole process. You want to maybe talk about that, a pre-sleep routine a little bit?
I mean, this comes down to, routines are literally everything when it comes to sleep and when it comes to really health in general. So one of the reasons why sleep is so impactful is when we talk about circadian rhythms. And the thing with circadian rhythms is every single facet of your physiology operates on a circadian rhythm, not just sleep. So when you perform at your best, when you should ideally be eating, when you should ideally be doing certain things, fall on a preferred rhythm. But if there's one practical takeaway, at all, it's the implementation and importance of having some semblance of a routine, not only pre-sleep, but post-sleep. And that not only set you up to succeed in sleep, but it'll set you up to succeed in your productivity and performance in a lot of other ways. In terms of what that specifically looks like for a pre-sleep routine, the first step is you have to just actually prioritize it and carve out a time to do it, right? But the actual interventions can really vary based on the person, right? So for me, for example, some of the go-to strategies that I use with clients are I have them journal. And journaling has a negative context sometimes, especially when we talk about like young athletes. They're like thinking that they're writing a diary at night. And you tell a 16 or 17-year-old, guy and, macho guy to do a diary, and it's not going to happen. But, across the board, what I mean by journaling is it's a brain dump, right? So a brain dump is just getting your thoughts, worries, to-dos on paper. And there's something profound about doing that I find has a really tremendous impact. Unfortunately, the time when we do most of our thinking is when our head hits the pillow, right? It's the only moment we have out of the day where we can actually process and download the day. When in reality, that's the last time we want to be thinking, right? So having things actually written down on paper really makes a big difference, because that it's written and you can deal with it tomorrow. It kind of puts your mind at ease a little bit, and it's relaxing to just write these things out. Forms of breath work and meditation work really well. Having some type of wind down routine where you're dimming the lights and dimming the temperature a little bit, those kind of provide really good environmental cues for sleep. But it really comes down to just the prioritization of that routine. So something that I think people focus on in the wrong way is, let's use the example of, like you were saying, the kid who gets home from practice, right? Or someone who gets home from practice and it's relatively late, and they know they've got to be up early. They know they're already home late. They're kind of wired from practice. They're wired from their game. They're wired from whatever, right? The idea would be, well, I'm going to get as much sleep as I possibly can, right? So I'm going to go to bed right now, right? And right after I eat, I'm going to go to sleep. And as counterintuitive as it sounds, especially when we're playing the long game for sleep health, I would rather that athlete prioritize their routine and go to bed a half hour later in a better state, prepared for sleep, as opposed to focusing solely on the duration of sleep. And this is where that issue comes from, because most people entirely focus too much on the duration. They only view sleep health in terms of the duration of time. Like, if I don't get 7 hours or I don't get 8 hours, but there's a lot of other elements that go into it. We've all experienced it where you may have been in bed for 8 hours, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to wake up feeling refreshed, right? So, like I said, as counterintuitive as it might sound, you're always better going to bed a little bit later, prioritizing a routine that gets your brain and your body into the right state for sleep.
Let me ask you this, because right now, routines are really, really messed up, right?
Of
And
course,
we'll
yeah.
see it with kids too. It's like, okay, hey, we do have a day off. It's a Sunday or it's a Saturday. We had a game on Friday night. It's Saturday, and now I'm sleeping in till 10, 11. I've had some kids like, hey, I slept until 1 o'clock. I'm like, dude, you're going to, you need to get up. You're going to have bed sores. You've been sleeping so much. Because they literally, over the weekend, or when they can find that window, and even now I'm talking to our athletes, and they're like, well, I'm not getting up. I don't have to be up at 6:30 to train or do whatever. So I'm sleeping till 9, 10 o'clock, getting up. And now then they're also staying up till 2, but they're like, well, I'm still getting my 7 hours, but I'm going to bed at 2 o'clock, and now I'm getting up at 10 instead of going to bed at 10 and getting up at 6 or 7. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How
So
important is that to make sure that that's taken care of, like you said, the routine?
Yeah, so the routine is always going to be important regardless of the timing. And this is kind of when we talk about sleeping in on the weekends, and, if I'm talking more the adult population, sleeping in on weekends is always going to be the enemy, because it comes back to that circadian rhythm. And one of the regulators of that circadian rhythm is sleep timing, right? So basically the idea with circadian rhythms is every cell and every process in your body has a rhythm, and it has cues that can dictate that rhythm, things like when you eat and when you sleep. And if you disrupt that rhythm, you disrupt all the subsequent elements of your body and all these other clocks. So you can throw off everything by disrupting your timing. And if you sleep in on the weekends, you're basically hitting the reset button on your internal clock every Monday when you try and go back to whatever time you had to get up. So consistency is always going to be the key. I usually try to tell people not to fluctuate too much within, say, a half hour or 45 minutes of when your normal wake time or sleep time is. However, when we talk about high school kids and we talk about athletes at that age, it's a pretty crappy situation, because they're getting the short end of the stick. And I think a lot of people don't realize this. And, I have this conversation with parents a lot. Your circadian rhythm changes throughout your lifespan, right? So when you're a baby, your circadian rhythm is where it's at. And then as you age, right, your circadian rhythm actually gets a little bit later, to where a teenager's circadian rhythm actually does run late. So the teenager that wants to be up until midnight is not just being a rebellious teenager. that's literally their rhythm, and that's what their rhythm is telling you. When you get into adulthood, it kind of comes back and regulates a little bit, where you kind of fit into what we call chronotypes, these preferences in your sleep. But for the vast majority with teenagers, we're talking about their circadian rhythm is pushed back, where in an ideal world, if they weren't up for school and practice super early, their real ideal rhythm would be going to bed at, say, midnight or 11:30 midnight, and waking up at 8, 9 o'clock. So that's where it's a lot harder to regulate, because if a teenage athlete is sleeping in on the weekends, they're just trying to go with what their natural rhythm is. And very often, because of all the times that they're trying to wake up early against what their natural rhythm is, they're building up what we call a sleep debt. And when you have that sleep debt and sleep pressure built up, that's when you can get, kids that do sleep in until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They're not just being lazy. In a lot of cases, they do have a sleep debt actually built up. So, it's a difficult situation to manage. It's finding the balance between routines and consistency, but also understanding that their rhythm is a little bit later. So letting them be a little bit lenient within that rhythm, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So if they needed to, though, because again, they are getting up early, does it really does it mess things up, or can you kind of change it by getting into that routine to say, yes, I know you want to go to bed at 12, but because you do have to get up earlier, let's work to push that back and get your routine so that you're in bed by 10:30, quarter to 11.
Definitely. Yeah.
Can that kind of change the cycle, or is it just, like you said, until they can get that debt made up, it's just going to be a tough week until they can catch up on the weekend?
It'll be a certain element of having them catch up, but you can always manipulate it a little bit with the right cues and the right routine. It just, again, it comes back to that prioritization. So you could definitely manipulate it a little bit, where, you implement the routine to start them winding down, but just the understanding of the associations with sleep. So I'll give an example of, the athlete who's typically going to bed, the teenage athlete, he's typically going to bed at midnight, right? But he or she's got to be up at 5 or 6, that next morning. So it's just not feasible, right? We should be getting them to bed a little bit earlier. And we try to bump it to 10:30. We say, all right, we're going to make and structure your routine around getting you to bed at 10:30. Understand that with circadian rhythms, there's two regulating systems. There's the environmental cues and factors that we can give them, right? Light, winding down, temperature, food timing, all these things can manipulate a little bit and provide the right signal. But the other half of this is a genetic component, right? To, like I said, circadian rhythms for teenagers are just a little bit later. That's ingrained in the DNA. Like, you can't necessarily completely bat against that. So back to that example, let's say we try to bump it up to 10:30, and they go to bed, they lay down at 10:30, they prioritize their routine, they did all the right things, they checked all the boxes, but now they're laying there and they can't sleep, right? And they're still wired. Now we have to weigh the pros and cons of, having them be in bed just for the sake of being in bed and getting restful sleep. Because what ends up happening here is negative associations form. And these actually carry into adulthood, believe it or not, where, once you lose your ability and your confidence to sleep, just by laying there and not being able to sleep, that really perpetuates a vicious cycle where the mental aspect really kicks in, and you just feel like anytime you lay down, you're not going to sleep. So as powerful of an association as we can keep, bed timing and sleeping as possible, is really going to be valuable. So, going back to that example again, we have to weigh the pros and cons of, for that athlete or that teenager, is it better to maybe try 11 o'clock now? And at 11 o'clock, they're not feeling as anxious and not as kind of still strung. We've still pushed it back a little bit and manipulated it. They may only be getting what we would, say is 7 or 7.5 hours, but it's restful and it's not setting them up in the long term to, have poor sleep habits and poor sleep thoughts, if that makes sense.
Well, let me ask you this. So is it better to have somebody like, from 10:30 to 11, instead of saying you're going to bed, it's like, hey, from 10:30 to 11, like you said, build a routine and say, look, during this next half hour, you're really just going to use that time to chill out. You're not going to be listening to music, or you're not going to be playing a video game. You're not going to, it's because it's like, well, if I'm not going to bed, then I'm going to be up playing video games. I'm talking to friends. and it's
Sure.
not letting the body, rest, and the mind kind of like, just like you said earlier, simmer down. So
Exactly.
like if you, let's move that window back to 11, but is that where you add the routine to go, okay, for 30, 45 minutes, let's really like wind that clock back a little bit so you're not so wound up, because even if you go to bed at 11, now you're not going to be asleep till 11:30, 11:45. It's those minutes that move up to the time you crawl into bed that make an effect. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, 100%. And I would always rather, like I said, those routines are so important, and just rest and recovery in general, right? So this is just a good example for, you know, if that athlete that we were talking about earlier who gets home from practice late, like, they're still a kid to a certain extent, obviously. And I mean, there has to be a time where you just hit the off button a little bit. And the only off button is not sleep. Sometimes the off button is these wind down routines of like, just, I mean, kids obviously are always on social media and they're always on something. Even if it's just that half-hour break of not being on that, it doesn't have to be that they're in bed. If they take a 30-minute break off of social media and technology before bed and then get into bed, not only will they sleep better, but I think it serves a lot of benefits from just a like rest and regeneration standpoint all across the board.
Well,
So
let me ask you this, and you brought up too. So like, let's just say the window from 8 o'clock till 10:30 or 11, from a food nutrition standpoint. And then as we get older, I know there's some, folks that maybe take some sleep aids. Yes, no. And then like from a nutrition standpoint, are there some things that they maybe in the evening should be like, they get back from practice, they are hungry because they've had a long day of workouts, they're from that maybe 6:30 to 7:30, 8 o'clock window, they're taking in nutrients. Are there some
yeah.
things that we should really be aware of? And then as we get older, are there some natural process things instead of maybe taking from a chemical standpoint that folks are taking to knock themselves out?
Yeah. So first, from a nutritional perspective, and this is kind of across the board. In an ideal world, you have a 3-hour window roughly where it's when you've had your last bite of something and then sleep time. And the reason for that is a few things. Firstly, when your body is prioritized with digestion, it doesn't have as much to focus on actually being able to sleep. Eating actually elevates your body's core temperature as well. So similarly to exercise, where exercise will elevate your, certain stress hormones and will elevate your body temperature. And when you initiate sleep, you actually need your core body temperature to drop a degree or two. So that would be in an ideal world. But back to that situation of, the athlete who comes home and they're hungry and, don't go to bed hungry. Especially when you talk about the importance of needing to be able to replenish from a rough training session or a game or whatever it is. That's always going to be more valuable. So it's a balance. And so maybe in that instance, it's having a meal. And when we talk about like specifics of the meal, nothing spicy, then you're talking like potential for heartburn or anything else. Ideally not simple sugars, grains. It's really the things that you would think, right? The things that are pretty obvious that you wouldn't want to have right before bed, or the things that you wouldn't really want to have any other time, really. So nothing, groundbreaking there in terms of what you should be eating. So maybe in that situation, it's finding the balance of, you try to eat as soon as possible as you get home, right? You don't delay it, you eat. And then it comes down to maybe we push that routine back a little bit, not to say you're going to bed an hour and a half later than your normal scheduled time. But remember, we do have a 30 to 45 minute buffer of, your normal time. Like if your sleep time is normally 11, if you push back to 11:30, prioritize your routine and gave yourself a little bit more time to digest the food you ate, that's always going to be more than fine. And it's going to be preferred as opposed to, trying to force yourself to sleep when you're still digesting and still, having that elevated body temperature.
Well, let me ask you this about the over the counter, not necessarily prescribed, but over the counter type sleep aids. What's the good thing? What's the negative thing? Like, and I have some, older clients that say, well, yeah,
Yeah.
I take the Z, like, NyQuil, but it's the Z-Quil or whatever it's called. I'm just using that example, not knocking a product,
Yeah.
but just,
Yeah. No.
they're taking something to say, man, it really helps me get a lot better quality sleep at night. Is that something that, yes, you should know, like wean yourself off if it's needed, or you should stay away
Yes.
from it altogether?
So me as a coach, I'm always going to err on the side of I'd rather you be able to do it on your own and through natural means first, right? So the problem with any sleeping pill or any pill in general, as we know, right, is that it doesn't address the root cause. So I think I touched earlier on, the fact that most sleep issues are behavioral in nature. So, if underlying behaviors are the driving issue, this comes down to changing anything in your health and behavior, right? If we don't address the underlying behaviors, we can't expect success long term. So, a sleeping pill or over the counter aid is always going to be just a band-aid. First, talking about prescribed sleeping pills. Again, I don't want to instill fear in people, but it's important, I think, to know the facts. Sleeping pills and even over-the-counter aids, in a lot of cases, do not induce naturalistic sleep. So what I mean by that is, how I would know that you're in sleep and know what stage of sleep you're in is you would be in a sleep lab and I'd have you hooked up to all these crazy machinery and we'd be looking at your brain waves, right? And based on what's occurring in your brain, based on these brain waves, we would know, all right, great, Mark is sleeping and Mark is in stage 2 of non-REM sleep, or Mark is in stage 3 of non-REM sleep. However, when you look at the brain waves of an individual who is on a sleeping pill, especially right at the onset of sleep, it is not the same. And I think the thing to note there is that sedation is not sleep. So a lot of these are sedatives, and this kind of the same thing as alcohol. And I'm sure you've had someone who has said, oh yeah, man, I have a glass of wine before bed and it knocks me right out. And that's exactly it. It knocks you out, right? And sedation is not sleep. So there's a difference between sedating your brain and inducing naturalistic sleep. So because of that, and when we look at sleeping pills, those that are prescribed, most of them were tested and approved for short-term use, weeks, even, days and weeks. And in those cases, they can certainly still be beneficial. If you're stuck in a vicious cycle, maybe following a loss or, something tragic that we all unfortunately go through at some point, or even in a situation like what we're dealing with right now, they can be beneficial to get you out of the hole. But this is where I think coaching comes into play, is that you still have to address the underlying issues and you still have to make sure it doesn't become a long-term thing. But the problem is that people take, in a lot of cases, they take sleeping pills long-term. So those weeks become months and even years. And what we've been finding more and more over the last few years is that when you take these pills for months and even years, they start to come with some pretty serious health risks, unfortunately. And again, this is where the fear aspect. So if you're someone who's listening and you are currently taking sleeping pills and you are currently struggling with sleep, skip over this part or pause this part because it won't do you any good. And I mean that, just from my experience. But sleeping pill use is being correlated with mortality. So basically, we see a relationship where even just mild use of sleeping pills predicts a lower mortality, an increased mortality. And what we also find is that it's a linear relationship. So as the sleeping pill usage increases, we see the mortality risk increase as well. There's also been some linkages that have shown sleeping pills to be linked to certain cancers of the bowel, cancer of the prostate, cancer of the breast. So not to condemn sleeping pills and say they don't serve a purpose, but just understanding those risks that are there and that they don't address the root cause. However, over-the-counter aids, it's a similar story in the sense that they don't induce the naturalistic sleep and they don't address the root cause. It's less of the health risks, right? Because when I'm talking about that mortality and cancer risk, I'm talking about like prescribed pills like Ambien and Lunesta or any of those, right? Over-the-counter aids, it's less of that risk, and they certainly can serve a benefit here and there, but it's just understanding that it doesn't address the root cause. So if we're playing the long game of having long-term success for sleep, you don't want to be reliant on having to take NyQuil or any of those, NyQuil Z or any of those that are out there to have to, be able to sleep.
What about some of the natural things? Like, I have some folks that say like, part of the routine, it's like, well, I have herbal tea, or I might take, I know I got a friend that talks about like first responders. He talks to them about taking zinc and, ZMA, which sometimes the magnesium. So from the natural end of it, the old thing of drink warm milk before you go to bed, those type of things. Is there truth to that? Are those good things? Or, from that standpoint of natural remedies, I guess?
Yeah, there is to a certain extent. I still will come back to not being reliant on anything. I'm always a proponent of whatever facet I'm working with someone. I want them to be autonomous in what they're able to do on their own, right? Whether it's exercise or sleep, I want them to be able to manage the situation on their own. So sleeping is something that we all do and very much of. So I want people to be able to manage their own sleep without having to take any kind of aid if possible. So if I'm coaching someone, I'm always trying to work towards not using anything, even if it is natural. With that being said, there definitely are some, natural aids that have been shown to be beneficial. Magnesium is a big one. You kind of mentioned ZMA. So, the magnesium has been well worked out in some research that can be beneficial. Melatonin is the big one that people talk quite a bit about. Melatonin being what we call darkness hormone or sleep hormone, even though it does a variety of other things. One of the things it does is to signal timing for sleep. It signals that it's time for you to sleep. And melatonin can be beneficial in a few situations. So first I'll tell you the situations where it's beneficial, and then I'll just say some of the caveats with melatonin. So the situations it's beneficial are in situations of jet lag or shift work, because your timing is completely opposite of off of what it normally is. So it's something that can help you to reset, along with things like the same things we talked about earlier, right? Light, food timing, all those things as well. So in situations like that, it can be beneficial. In elderly adults, we find that sometimes they have a blunted circadian rhythm a little bit. So in some of those cases, melatonin supplementation can be beneficial to restore some of that timing and their rhythm a little bit. Now the caveats. The biggest one is that because it's not FDA regulated and it's just like many other supplements that you could just go out and buy, the actual dosage of what is in a lot of these melatonin supplements varies quite a bit. They did a study that was pretty scary, and they took a bunch of melatonin supplement brands, and they looked at and tested the actual dosage relative to what they were claiming was on the bottle. And what they found was that it was anywhere from 80% less to 400% more than what was actually claimed on the box or the bottle. And we have to be careful with that, because even when the dosing is right, people are usually taking way more melatonin than they should be. People talk about taking 5 or even 10 milligrams of melatonin, and that is entirely too much. And what ends up happening when you do that is you can blunt your body's natural ability to produce melatonin on its own. And your body should be obviously producing melatonin on its own, and that is still helping you to signal to sleep. So if you take too much, you're going to blunt your body's natural ability, and that's the last thing you want. So usually I'll tell people, 1 milligram to 2 milligram, 3 at the absolute most is kind of where you want to target.
Nice. Hey, let me kind of shift in just a little bit, but naps.
Yeah.
Especially now, because routines are kind of messed up from we're normally in school, then afternoon I have practice. Kids are doing different things, and I'll talk to a number of kids, and we're doing some online stuff, of course, with kids, and they're like, oh, I just woke up from my nap. I'm like, well, dude, that's why your workout's not going to be very good, because you literally just woke up 5 minutes ago.
For sure.
Napping, good, bad, throws off your cycle. Is that if somebody's tired, and depend what they're doing, or where would naps fit into the whole thing?
Yeah, so we'll go through a few of the caveats and situations, but much like most things in the industry, it depends, right? That's always the answer we have to give to everything, because it does. Yeah. There's a couple rules of thumb that I think are really important with naps. Firstly, again, I'm putting my coaching hat on. Anyone who is currently struggling with sleep or has been struggling with sleep for a long time, do not nap. And the reason for that is we talked a lot about circadian rhythms, obviously. The other mechanism that occurs for you actually sleeping is a buildup of what we call sleep pressure. And it's via way of a buildup of chemicals in your brain that build up throughout the day. The most common is adenosine. And as these chemicals build up for every second that you're awake, the more of these that are present, the more of a signal for sleepiness that you get. And this works to our benefit when we're trying to sleep at night. When it hits in the middle of the day and we have too much of it, obviously, it works against us. But when you are struggling with sleep and when you nap, you're depleting that sleep pressure, right? So that's how we rid our brain of these chemicals. We sleep, right? So when we nap, we're depleting some of that. So then if you go to bed at night, and especially if you're someone who has trouble falling asleep, you really want a lot of that healthy sleep pressure to help you. You actually, sometimes what I'll do with people is we build up so much of that sleep pressure by having them stay up a little bit later that they just have no choice but to fall asleep. It's so overwhelmingly powerful, that sleep pressure. So you want that to be able to work to your advantage if you're really struggling with sleep. So that's the first caveat is if you're struggling with sleep in any way, especially falling asleep, you should probably not be napping, at least for right now. The other caveats are, this is now assuming that you have otherwise healthy sleep, right? You don't have sleep issues, you don't have a sleep disorder, none of these things, right? In those instances, there's a couple things that are important: timing and duration. So timing is very important. I usually like to have at least 7 hours or 8 hours between the end of your nap and when your bedtime is. And the reason for that is exactly the sleep pressure that I was just talking about, where you want to let that sleep pressure build back up. And if you don't allow enough time, we're missing out on one of the cues for sleep. So, ideally, timing, leave at least, 7, maybe even 8 or 9 hours between when you sleep and when your nap is. So don't finish your nap at, 4 or 5 p.m. and go to bed at, 9 or 10, because it's not enough time to build that back up. The other thing is the duration of the nap. And I think this is kind of like the wild, wild west with like how people nap. Usually when you get like someone who's just sleeping for 2-3 hours, they have so much of that sleep debt built up, like we talked about earlier, that, we probably have to dive in a little bit and figure out what's going on with that person and really have them figure out their nighttime sleep routine first. I would even say that person probably has a sleep issue. However, the duration, we should be looking at 2 types of naps. We should be looking at what I call like a cognitive reset. And this is like what people will call a power nap, right? Where it's, 20 to 30 minutes where we're not really getting into deep sleep necessarily, but we can still get some benefits in being able to focus a little more. And, we get a little cognitive reset. These came from, pilots actually would do these when they were on long flights. That's where the power nap came from, right? They'd be on these 24-hour flights where obviously you don't want your pilot going back and, sleeping for 6-7 hours instead of flying your plane. So they would take these, 15, 20, 25-minute naps. The other type should be about 75 or 80 to 90 minutes where you're actually trying to get all of the stages of sleep. So when I talk about all the stages of sleep, you go through all of the stages of sleep every 90 minutes throughout the night. So you go through the lighter stages of sleep, the deeper stages of non-REM sleep, your rapid eye movement or dream sleep. You go through all of these cycles every 90 minutes, and they all serve different benefits. They all give you different things. So the goal there would be to try and go through all of those stages and then wake up at the end of that, where we actually do wake up every 90 minutes at the end of these cycles. We just usually don't remember it, hopefully, right? Or we don't realize it. But anything in between those 2 times or anything longer than that, and we're either missing out on some of the benefits, or we're going to get, like exactly like you explained earlier, what we call sleep inertia, where, you get woken out of a nap and it's, say, 60 minutes where you're right in the middle of your sleep cycles and it feels awful, right? And there's no way you're going to be able to perform well or really do anything because you're just getting yanked out of the middle of deep sleep, and it's just awful. So
let me ask you this, and not selling a product, but like, the monitor systems that you wear on your wrist and then you have it on your phone and it'll give you your sleep cycles. Good, bad? Is that a good way to track, or it's looks neat? Is it throwing you, giving you false data that you really shouldn't like put a whole lot of stock in, or what are your thoughts on that?
Of course, I'm going to be a broken record. I'm going to say it depends, because it does. And the it depends portion is, again, back to that person who's struggling with sleep, because we know that sleep issues are behavioral and very often behavioral. What I mean by that is that the stress and anxiety that they have around their sleep that perpetuates and builds up drives a lot of their issues. So now if I introduce a sleep tracker, where I'm going to take an example of someone, and they can be an athlete or they can be a general population person who's a little bit older, and they're struggling with sleep. And we say, great, we'll even use you as an example, right? You've been struggling with sleep, and I'm going to start working with you, and I'm going to say, great, Mark, you know what, to track our sleep, I'm going to give you a sleep tracker, and we're going to start using it, and we're going to start tracking your data. And now you're a poor sleeper right now. So I don't expect very good numbers coming out of your sleep tracker data, right? And now you wake up every single morning and you look down at the numbers that are shitty numbers and you go, wow, this sucks. I'm a really bad sleeper, right? But these things perpetuate, these thoughts perpetuate. And now I've introduced yet another variable that gives that person stress and anxiety around their sleep, especially if they're the type that doesn't do well with that information. So I always talk about, like, when working with like a team of athletes, you have to know your athletes and know which guys can do better with the data. And it's obviously not always feasible to say, all right, half the team is tracking and half the team is not, but knowing, who works well in the face of having data where they're going to take that information and be motivated and driven by it, versus the individual who they get that data and it just promotes more anxiety for them. It just doesn't work. So again, back to the person who's struggling with sleep, I would say to not use sleep trackers just at the onset. However, on the other side of things, sleep trackers are doing a lot of great things for sleep and sleep health in general. Firstly, they've come a long way. They are getting increasingly more accurate. So there's different layers to the accuracy. So there's stage 1 accuracy, and stage 1 is where they're all really good, which is estimating sleep duration. How long did you sleep last night? And they're good here. Stage 2 is distinguishing between what we call non-REM sleep and REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. These are the two main categories. Right. And they're pretty good here too. A little bit less than the duration, but they're still good. Now, when we get into take non-REM sleep, for example, there's 4 stages of non-REM sleep. And when we start to get into distinguishing between, you spent 2 hours in stage 3 and you spent an hour in stage 2, and it becomes increasingly less accurate, right? So there's different layers to it. However, I always tell people that if you're using a sleep tracker, they are consistently inaccurate. So what I mean by that is, what sleep trackers are doing a really great job at is they're providing some awareness into how certain variables can impact your sleep. For example, what you did the night before. Did you prioritize your routine or not? Did you have a glass of wine? Did you, did you eat late? Did you, whatever it is, right? Or is there a period of increased stress? You start to connect the dots in terms of how certain things can impact your sleep. So I think from that standpoint, they provide a lot of awareness. And if you have otherwise healthy sleep and you just want to dive a little bit deeper, they're consistently providing that awareness, right? So they may not be 100% accurate, but when we create a baseline for someone and then they all of a sudden start having a glass of wine before bed and we see the baseline dip lower, we now know we can connect the dots. You know what I mean? So, so in that way, that the awareness side of things, they can certainly serve a benefit, but we just have to be careful of, the use cases for implementing them.
So let me ask, how does, like, I'm just using a monitor when it goes through the different stages, said, like you said, oh, you were up last night for 45 minutes total and you're up. Is it based on heart rate, movement patterns, or when somebody's looking at that, it's like, well, this data doesn't, like I've looked at before and I'm like, this says I was up for an hour and 5 minutes. I'm like you said, I don't remember any of it. I'm like, well, in my head, I'm like, well, that can't be real because I can't believe I was up that much during the 6 hours or whatever. How does that rate that or give that reading?
Yeah, so every device is different, and every device will be different levels of accuracy. Some devices that aren't targeted specifically at tracking sleep are less accurate because they're focused on doing other things as well, right? Like take a Fitbit, for example. A Fitbit will certainly track your sleep, but it's also processing and doing all these other things. So, it may be a little bit less accurate at sleep. How they work, they used to all be just actigraphy, and some of them still are actigraphy. Actigraphy is just looking at your movement. So it's tracking as you move. And the idea is that based on that, how much movement, we can kind of get an idea of being awake versus being asleep versus being in different stages. Not all that accurate when we talk about really distinguishing, obviously. And some of those are still only using actigraphy, like the ones that are, you put under your mattress or you put next to, there's an app I think you put next to your nightstand, which that's BS. I'm sorry. Like there's just no way that you're going to get really, really good data from that. It has to actually be on your person. But now they're all implementing more data. So like if we take the Oura Ring, for example, that goes on your finger here, it's looking at heart rate variability, respiratory rate. it's taking into account more variables. And the more variables that it's taking into account, typically the more accurate it actually is. But the reason why we can't get to that stage 3 of accuracy of really pinpointing, how much time is in stage 2 versus stage 3, is because, like I mentioned earlier, we know that by looking at brain waves. So until we're actually looking at brain waves while you sleep, we're going to have a hard time being 100% accurate all the time.
So let me ask you this too. So, because you were talking about the cycles and usually a 90-minute cycle, a couple of different things. I've had some parents ask me about this too, where their kids kind of go through that growth stage. They're like, well, man, now they usually were sleeping 7-8 hours. Now they can go ahead and sleep 9 or 10. Is it a good, if time is available, is there a thing where, 7-8 hours is optimal? You really need, if you're in that growth spurt, you really need 9 to 10. Are there kind of set parameters for that?
I wouldn't say there's set parameters because there still is some individuality, but like we talked about, the circadian rhythm timing changing throughout your lifespan, sleep duration changes throughout your lifespan, where, an adolescent and a teenager does require more sleep than an adult. So when there is that instance where they're craving and need 9-10 hours of sleep, that is a physiological need that you should try and let them get when they can, if possible. So there definitely is something to that for sure. Where the sleep need in terms of duration and quality changes throughout your lifespan, just based on development, right? Because as we're developing, if we even look at through the lifespan, the percentages of sleep stages changes as well, where if you look at a baby and a toddler and even an adolescent, they're getting way more REM sleep, or rapid eye movement dream sleep, because their brain is under so much development. And the REM sleep is where we're getting a lot of that emotionally memory consolidation and restorative sleep from a cognitive standpoint, where they're getting a lot of the brain benefits during those stages of REM sleep. So it changes throughout the lifespan based on where they are developmentally as well.
Okay, and then and I know we got to get wrapped up, but from a standpoint of like sleep apnea and the sleep machines and those type of things too, because I've had some folks talk about that. Something they should do. Is there things from a natural standpoint instead of like the sleep machine that they could look at to do? I know like weight loss, we talk about some of that stuff with folks too, but from a sleep apnea standpoint, the medical effects and how it affects your sleep. I know people think they're getting sleep a lot of times, but it really can affect them from a negative standpoint.
Yeah, I'm glad you actually brought this up, because it's always a good thing to take away, and it's a huge point. So whether you're an individual who's listening, who this might be you, or you're a coach or a trainer or practitioner who has people that they work with, sleep apnea is a real problem, and it's a really undersold problem right now, in the sense that they estimate that roughly 80% of sleep apnea is currently going undiagnosed. And there's certainly varying severities to this, but when we talk about severe sleep apnea, and for those who don't know, sleep apnea is basically a cessation of breathing in the middle of the night, where due to some airway restriction, there could be a lot of different causes, whether they're environmental. Obesity can obviously be a big trigger, having a collapsed palate within your tongue, all these things that I won't dive into, but back to the point of, if I lost my train of thought there, but
like what should they, if they think they do, what would be the process to, or is there like, again, are there natural things that they can do, or should they go to the doctor? Is that like the only thing that really can take care of it?
Yeah. So, well, back a step. I mean, if you are a snorer, why there's so many people undiagnosed with apnea is people have normalized snoring, right? Oh yeah, I'm just a snorer, or, my husband or my wife is a snorer. That's just the way it is. And we all go through periods where we can snore, where you could have a cold, your airway is a little more restricted, you're congested, and you might snore. But chronic snoring long-term is not normal. If we're getting normal airway and airflow exchange during the night, we shouldn't have snoring. And snoring can often be an indicator of apnea. Some other indicators that you want to be looking for are, morning headaches, daytime fatigue, waking up with a dry mouth. Any of these things are really, telltale signs or hallmark signs of apnea. Really, the only way to diagnose sleep apnea is to go for a sleep study and actually go in a lab where they can see, are you actually getting these, cessations of breathing that can be, sometimes for people who have severe sleep apnea, it can be up to like 60 times a night, where they're getting these bouts of hypoxia, right? Where they're not getting oxygen, they're not actually breathing. So if you're someone who suspects it, you've been a snorer for a while, or you have a client who's been a snorer for a while, you absolutely have to get a sleep study done. You have to get it screened. You want to make sure. The reason why I say, that intervention is important, as opposed to just trying to, get a device or get some, herb or something that might help you, is there are a lot of different reasons why you can have apnea. Like I mentioned, some of them can be lifestyle based, but some of them can just be poor respiratory patterns. Some of them can be, from a dental perspective, your tongue position. And so, you want to, again, back to like I talked about with the sleeping pills, you want to be able to address the root cause. So a CPAP machine is often prescribed and it's often a part of the equation, but sometimes, again, not addressing the root cause. So this is why I say in those instances, you want to work with a qualified professional. There's a lot of good, look for pulmonologists that will specialize in apnea, look for, dentists that will specialize in apnea as well. There's, quite an increasing amount of them, but you really want to make sure you get it done the right way, because, so people who have severe sleep apnea, I mean, we're talking some pretty significant health risks where your risk for a cardiovascular event is about 5 times higher. So it's pretty significant stuff that we don't want to underestimate. So, don't belittle, snoring as just being something that's the norm.
Yeah. Well, I sure appreciate you coming on. And for those folks that would love to get a hold of you, get more information, what's the best way for them, Nick, to get a hold of you?
Yeah, for sure. So on pretty much all platforms and all avenues, I am the online sleep coach. I go by the online sleep coach. So on Instagram, the online sleep coach. On Facebook, the online sleep coach as well. I'm always accessible via email for questions. onlinesleepcoach@gmail.com. My website is onlinesleepcoach.com. And then I have a website that is more geared towards practitioners and coaches, where I'm going to be offering up a course in the next couple months that basically dives into all things sleep and how to actually coach it up. And that's sleepcoachcourse.com.
Hey, and you got a summit coming up too in the first part of May too. Do you want to mention that? Because for some of the coaching, do they have to be coaches, or could they be a parent of an athlete, or maybe it's one of our boot campers that are listening that want to get more information on it?
For sure. I mean, it's open to everyone. It is a completely free event. It's May 1st and 2nd. It's a completely virtual event. If you go to sleepcoachcourse.com/virtual summit, you can find the registration page there. It is definitely geared more towards practitioners, but I wanted to do some type of virtual event. I wanted to make it free. For the coaches that are listening, especially strength and conditioning coaches, it's approved for free CEUs through the NSCA, 1.4 CEUs, category A. So, really, really good opportunity there. We've got close to 3,000 already registered, which is pretty amazing. And, it's not just me talking by any means. We have 30 speakers. And we have 30 speakers who are really some of the best in the field. I mean, in all avenues, some top conditioning experts, mindset, nutrition. It's a really great roster that I'm, really grateful for. So, it's open to everyone. It's a free event. So,
and just let our folks know, we'll post that up on our Facebook page through the Coach Rozy Facebook page, Mark Rosen Facebook page too. So look for that, because we'll have that posted up to help Nick out. But if you're interested, we'll be able to get you signed up there too. So, Nick, I sure appreciate taking the time to come on. I know you're running and busy, but appreciate it, and hope you're staying healthy and strong and well.
Yeah, likewise. Same to you. And
appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. And gang, hey, join us each Wednesday. Remember, 10 o'clock, Chalk Talk. And just come back to Coach Rozy's Facebook page. We have content information up. So, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, you can write those questions down, and we'll either get those to Nick and make sure he's answered, or we'll try to answer it. But we'll get your questions answered too. So thanks for joining us today, and make it a great one. Thanks, Nick.